Our last presenter of today, last but not least, we're very pleased to have Bruce Wainman here, Director of Education Program in Anatomy at McMaster University. He is recognized for the quality of his teaching, having received multiple awards, including the 3M National Teaching Fellowship that Allison was just awarded. His presentation will demonstrate anatomic specimens in all formats, including mixed reality applications in an interactive setting to emphasize the benefits and problems of each form of learning object. Hope I got that right. Sure. Bruce, would you like to join us? Sure. Thank you.
Okay, so I did learn something this morning about technology. If you don't sync your Dropbox, it's not where your talk is not there. So I wrote this at 6 a.m. Don't hold it against me. So there you go. Right. So that's who I am, indeed. And I had a very, very simple question that I had to answer at one point. It's simply, what's the easiest way to learn anatomy? So I brought this up. This is like a teddy bear for an anatomist. They always need something to carry when they're talking and teaching. This, of course, is a pelvis, not just a charming hat, but an extremely complex piece of anatomy made up actually of 3 bones and a whole lot of ligaments and that sort of thing. And the great thing about the pelvis, the female pelvis, there's lots of great things, but the only ones I can talk about at this point are mainly that is essentially anatomy in a bowl. So the pelvis doesn't really look at all the same from the front and the back. It doesn't look the same from the obstetrical view or from the sort of general surgery view up here, so the baby's head view. And it's actually really complex, very difficult anatomy to teach to people, as it turns out. But we've been teaching anatomy for a very long time. I mean, let's see, Da Vinci, besides being a pretty fair painter, was an anatomist. And I mean, that's 500 years of teaching. And he was drawing pictures of this and trying to teach it, you know, at that time. And we haven't really figured out what's the best way to do this. You'd think we'd have worked it out. And it turns out that, much to most people's surprise, anatomy is in fact a hotbed of educational research. And the reason is that partially because anatomy is getting marginalized a little bit, because I think at one time anatomy education was what medical education was. When you went to get medical education, you had 1,400 hours of anatomy, and then they just kicked you out into the community to learn out all the rest of it. But we have less and less time, and if you're like me, I have 3 campuses full of medical students that are spread all over Southern Ontario. And so we're constantly making new materials for them to learn from. So I'm just going to put this down because it's awkward. So the question is, what's the best object? And the reason why that came up is I had to make a lab that was going to work in 3 different places. We have a lab centrally in Hamilton, but we have one in Waterloo, and we have another one in Niagara region. And anything I make in one place has to be accessible in the other. And so I was going through my anatomy lab, and we have thousands and thousands of specimens. We are what we call a prosected lab, which means professionally dissected, so the material is ready for the students to look at. We have a problem-based program, and so that's why we need to have the material ready for them. And so everyone said, well, you should just take pictures and send them. And of course, I thought I was just the coolest guy, so we should scan them in 3D, we should take pictures in 3D, we should do all that sort of thing. And so when you're thinking, if I make a mistake, I'm going to make 3,000 more mistakes in a row if this doesn't really work out, I thought we should at least do some sort of study to see if there's any benefit to making a 3-dimensional object out of virtually all of my specimens. A very practical question, and that was 12 years ago when I started. And I had very little budget. So we started something called the Learning Modality Study, and it was what's really the best. And what we thought of as a virtual reality object, which back then virtual reality basically meant that you took something that was 3D and you put it on a flat screen and you could rotate it. Now that definition's definitely changed, but that's what we called it. And then we had pictures with just sort of front, back, and sides. And then we had models, just like that plastic model that I sent you. And so what was the best one? I mean, it seemed pretty obvious that, you know, these fantastic virtual reality models would be great. So there's that plastic model. There's our so-called virtual reality pelvis. So it's basically rotatable 2D views of a 3D object. So that cost me a fortune to make, something like $2,000. We took CT, computerized tomography scan, and we stacked them all up together. We cleaned them all up, and we made it into this nice model that you could rotate very easily on a screen and work with. And it was quite high tech. And here's the key views. Now, this is just a picture, so it's ridiculous when I show you a picture and tell you that's a model. Now, this is a picture. It actually looks the same, I understand that. But the point is that this is a picture that we showed people, and they had to learn front, back, and sides, and so they had a number of those together. And this is what we tested on. That's, in fact, a real human pelvis that's been prosected to show you all the ligaments and all that sort of thing. And so the study design was simple. We had 60 students at the time, and we had the different modalities. We gave them some structures to learn, and we gave them unlimited time, in fact, to do a test. And we even gave them a word bank to help them out because they would misspell things, as students do. And so the question was, what happened if we had the learning modality with the plastic model? Well, they do really well. In fact, they got about 70% of all those things in only 10 minutes to study, which is pretty spectacular. Now, students are smart, right? So let's go to the next one. Now we have key views. So key views is just front, back, and sides pictures, right? Okay, so as you probably predicted, that kind of sucked. Because it's really, in fact, difficult to go between all those different pictures and keep them organized. So we were sure that our virtual reality would be good, but it wasn't. And so we were really disappointed about it. I don't know why, because I didn't really want to digitize 3,000 specimens that way anyhow. But I was quite surprised about that plastic model was really quite so good. And so we actually had a huge effect. That's a 27% drop in performance when we gave them the virtual reality model. And I was sort of excited about that because you don't often get such clear results. And we redid it with other students and never had any problem finding that 20% or so loss. Remember that the basement mark on this is 25%, right? Multiple choice, more or less. And so you can't get much lower than this. So the conclusion was that the model really was superior for learning anatomy. And the question really, of course, then became, why was the model so much better? So most of us would have said handling the specimen, and all anatomists would have said this. They would have said, well, you handle the specimen, and somehow that just triggers all sorts of deep, important things inside of your brain, and that's going to make the big difference. So it was pretty easy. And the other question was really, well, the model looks the most like the pelvis we tested them on, right? That the learning that we had would transfer more easily. We went from 3D object to 3D object, right? Transfer appropriate processing is what was going on. So we had to test those because we're pretty excited now because we really want to find out what's going to work in all our labs, and really we haven't found anything else except we should buy way more models. And so we went through the transfer appropriate processing. So the first thing we did, we called the turntable study. And we called it Lazy Susan study originally, except for Sue in my lab got irritated. And the deal is that we put the plastic model on a turntable, and we just wouldn't let you touch it. In fact, we had a little line around, don't go past here. You can move the turntable, but you can't touch the specimen. And so the learning then was on this turntable. There it is, awkwardly animated. And then we tested them on the old wet specimen that we had. And so we went through a whole bunch more people and tested all of this. And so the question, and everybody, so if this was an anatomy meeting, you'd all be on the edge of your seats. Because this is really important to anatomists, because anatomists get all excited about the idea that you're handling it, it's going to make all the big difference, and everybody would say that it would work. And as it turns out, it doesn't really matter if you handle the specimen. At this meeting, you should just be really happy, because that's telling you that at least virtual reality and augmented and mixed reality has really great potential. If handling is not quite as important as we think, I'm not saying I've proved everything about it, but if it's not as important as we think, then some of these other technologies are somewhat promising. So that was pretty exciting. So our conclusions were really, it doesn't matter if you handle the model. And then the question, of course, was, did you just do better on the test because the 3D object that you handled is very much like that you were tested on? And so we went through this, and so we had to get people to learn on a 2D object and then be tested on a 3D object, and then learn on a 3D object but be tested on a 2D object. So pretty straightforward if you've given this talk enough times. Okay, so so there's our VR pelvis. Now that's really two-dimensional, right? You have to accept that that's 2D because it's really just a series of 2D things that you're rotating. It's not 3D. And there's a model on the turntable, which is clearly 3D, and then we just test them. And so we test on a picture of the wet specimen, right? Clearly 2D, and an actual wet specimen, which is now truly 3D because there you go. So what happened? So 3D, there's 2D learning and 3D testing. We did that already. And now we have 2D learning and 2D testing. So that would have been learning on the 2D model that you could twist, and then testing on the picture. How did they do? Well, if it's 2D to 2D, they should do... I know I'm talking and you're supposed to just listen, but you could help me here. They should do better, right? Clearly, they should do better, right? Because 2D to 2D. Right. Okay, so 3D. So 3D learning, so now they have the actual plastic model, but we do 2D testing on a picture, they should presumably do a little bit worse. And so what really happened is the question. That's the hypothesis. In fact, it didn't matter when they learned 2D, it didn't help them to be tested on 2D. They just didn't make any difference at all. And when we had them on, here we go, and it turns out that when you have the, just back up a little bit so you can remember, 3D learning and 2D testing, do you do worse because you're tested on 2D? No. 3D learning just turns out to be the best damn thing. And it turned out that was on the model was key. And so that's how that turned out. And we're pretty excited again about this because, again, it's just proving to us once again that these models are really important. So the quick summary is, you can see it across here really, is just every time that we seem to use a model that was real 3D, we just pretty much kicked butt. And it didn't matter how you tested or anything like that. It worked out a lot better. So really, there's no evidence that transfer-appropriate processing just really explained anything that we were seeing. The other thing is that virtual reality is certainly the way that we did it had a very poor version of reality because it wasn't even as good as this plastic model. So $2,000 VR specimen on a $3,000 computer, not as good as $200 plastic model. And so basically specimens and models pretty much rule because they're the real thing. So the question really is, does technology help or hinder? And this is like halfway through, so you don't have to come down to one side or the other yet. But those 3D projections onto 2D, okay, like that model that I made, the VR that we called it, well, they're busted. I really don't think they work very well. And I went back into the literature and dug around quite a lot. And okay, so this is the non-popular part of my talk, is that if you look at the studies, all the ones that have been done by people independently that made their own models in virtual reality and tested them, they all show that they're not as good as any proper model or anything. The ones that are funded somehow by the company directly or indirectly always show that they're really good. Now, I have to tell you that one of the things that really concerns me about that, besides the fact that it's nonsense, is that you've got a lot of those studies, and essentially what they're telling you is they give you, for example, and you can get these beautiful anatomy tables, and essentially they can show you X-ray, they can show you the body, they can show animations of things, and they're about $80,000. At best, 4 or 5 people at once can use them, and really the person using it gets the great experience. Everybody else is kind of nauseated by the person moving things around really quickly. And they're beautiful. I mean, I love them. But I have been doing anatomy for 30 years. And I don't get disoriented very easily when I'm moving around the body. Our average student loves them. And they're fooling around and they're completely lost after 5 seconds. Because that's what happens. It's this extremely disorienting environment. Now, I can go online and find you a whole bunch of papers saying that these tables are fantastic for anatomy learning. And what are they trialed against? Nothing. What they're telling you is an $80,000 table is better than sitting in a broom closet. These are smart people. It wouldn't have mattered what you gave them. They would have figured something out. But when you trial stuff against nothing, well, you're always going to win, because it is better than nothing. It's sure more expensive than nothing. And so those are important decisions that we make as educators every day. right? It's a value proposition we're talking about here. That's, by my calculation, that's 4,000 models, right? So you get an awful lot more, and it doesn't go, the model I showed you has been around for 25 or 30 years. And so they don't really wear out. You know, no one says, oh, we need 3.1 of that model. Get rid of that one. Nobody wants that. That's the low density model or low fidelity model. Doesn't work. So that doesn't actually cool my ardor for AR, VR, mixed reality, that sort of thing, because I really want it to work, and I really love it. I mean, I just love technology more than most people, I would say. So the question really is, what about stereopsis, right? That's a big question, because seeing it in 3D seemed to be really key, right? That was, because it wasn't touching it. What do we got left, really? There's just stereopsis and smell. And I'm pretty much sure that we're sticking with stereopsis. And so the deal is that we're looking at virtual reality headsets as certainly a possibility. There's issues with those. I got to tell you, my own personal bias, virtual reality, the thing that they simulate really nicely for me is nausea. Because I have a terrible time. Really, I can wear them for about 10 seconds. And I have a lot of problems with them on. But I know that lots of people like them, so I can do that. And the other thing we were going to do is look at something we call the pirate study. And why did we call it that? Because we remove stereopsis with a pirate patch. So it was a catchy title. And so the deal is that we're going to look at more virtual reality, and we're also going to remove stereopsis and see what happens. And we wanted to improve things, and we wanted to do it in the best way possible. And it turns out that certainly the most expensive way possible was to use HoloLens through Microsoft. So Michael, who's sitting back there, who's helped many of you find the pelvis that you lost every time you tapped on it in our HoloLens room, it convinced me this was a great idea, and we cobbled the money together. And it is an amazing headset. I think anybody who's played with it will tell you that. And I just think it's pretty cool. Now, I just wanted to go quickly through the pirate patch study, just because, well, it took me a lot of time. And the other thing is that what it's really trying to show you there, and it's just very quick, is if you take away someone's vision in one eye, they really, really hate it. And it actually doesn't matter if you do it on a 2D object or on a 3D object. They really don't like it when you take their vision away. So we have problems with that study, because it's just a very awkward thing to do when you take vision away. I have a much longer talk on removal of stereopsis and learning, but let me just tell you, it's more difficult than you'd think. Okay, so there you go. So enter the HoloLens. And we started about a year ago, I guess, really, applying to be developers on HoloLens and that sort of thing. It is what people call mixed reality. I don't want to get in that long debate about the difference between augmented and mixed. It's a species of augmented reality, I guess. And you see lots of great pictures on the internet like that. And so the question really, if stereopsis is the problem, then maybe this is the answer, because it is very convincing stereopsis. I'll give you that. Even when you see people do it. So if you happen to watch people using the HoloLens, what's the thing you notice the most about it? They put it on and they look in that kind of vaguely stoned way off into the middle distance. Like someone who's trying to ignore you in a bar, and they're looking across, pretend you're not even there. They look up, and the reason they're looking like that is that object is hanging convincingly in space in front of them, and they can focus on it, and you can't see it. And that gives them that sort of weird look that they have. I love that picture that we have. I take lots of pictures of that. But they just sort of vaguely look off into distance. Very convincing stereopsis. And so it does give very convincing holographic-like images. They are not, of course, holograms, right? That the holographic, it's a very difficult thing that they're talking about. Holograms are really made completely different technology. This that we see here is a variation of a trick called Pepper's Ghost. And if anybody's ever heard of that before, maybe if you've been to Disney World or Disneyland, and you go through on a little train and you look and there's a ghost, and they're playing a piano or something like that, that's a Pepper's Ghost trick. What's happening is that essentially they're reflecting that image off of something that you can see through, right? What you see is the reflection of something that's being projected, but it looks like it's hanging in space. It only works for you. because you have to be looking directly at it. It doesn't work from all angles. Holograms, all angles, right? They're fantastic. So if you happen to have seen, what was it, Snoop Dogg and Tupac Shakur speaking, or singing together, rap, I guess, not really up on the jargon. And so the deal is that they looked at both together on the stage, but clearly one was Pepper's Ghost, which was, I guess Tupac, since he's dead, was on there, and then Snoop Dogg, who is not, were standing together, but it was just an example of that. So that's exactly what it does, and it's a very clever, clever trick. But I mean, if it doesn't blow your mind, you have to realize there's a tiny projector inside of the headset that's doing that. Right? There's two tiny projectors, in fact, shooting little images that are coming back into your eyes. I mean, unbelievable. The thing that you have to remember that it's what you see online about the HoloLens is what we would call aspirational truth or lie. If you look at that image that you see right there, you can't do that. You can't do that. You can't, and you certainly can't cut it in half and move it around. And you see a lot of it. You see that. You can't do that either. It has nowhere near that kind of definition. It's not possible. I was so convinced that it could do that, though, that when I found out, thanks again to Michael, breaking my little tech heart, he said, no, that's all done in post-production, and it, in fact, is. I went down to Case Western to give a similar talk about this. They're going to try to get rid of all of their anatomy facilities and just have virtual reality stuff. And I said, you know, all the data that we've ever been able to collect so far says that's maybe a really bad idea. But they worked with HoloLens to make up some really beautiful videos. The videos are fantastic. If you haven't seen them, they are just fantastic. They are videos. Okay, so there you go. Moving on, we had some real fun trying to scan material for the HoloLens. So to get it in there is really very, very tricky. And you have to scan things in complete darkness. You have to use all sorts of contrasting, heavy contrasting colors to get really good things. This is making things for HoloLens, right? Not what the HoloLens needs. We manually rotated a lot of stuff, even just to make it even more perfect. We did at least 30 scans to get anything that we were putting in there. We have quite a good scanner. David 3D Systems, visible light scanner, quite a machine. In the end, we ended up with, you had to have things that were less than 150,000 vertices. For a few people in here, you're thinking, wow, and some people think, what the hell is he talking about? Apparently, that's pretty low. And that's not a really super high definition object. And the maximum texture is 2048 by 2048, which is actually pretty low. The reason for that is that when you do end up scanning something, the vertices aren't so much the problem, but when you stretch texture over top of them. So when you go from making an OBJ file, which is a 3D object, to making a FBX file, which is a textured 3D object, the texture takes a lot of data. And so that's what we struggled with. So this object that you see in our little demonstration, which is not to no one's surprise, a scan of a pelvis, you will find, in fact, is the maximum resolution that we can get out of that. So the HoloLens is, everything you see is sitting on your head. There's no tethers, there's no nothing. That's a fully functional Windows 10 machine working on your head, batteries and all. I mean, that's amazing technology, but there are compromises. The big compromise is the field of view. Most of you who have tried it on or have seen it online, it looks like you can see everything everywhere. In reality, the field of view is pretty narrow. People find that difficult. Now, I'm going to go into the last part, which is talking about optimizing learning with the HoloLens. And this really is to encourage everybody to get out there and start experimenting with these things. We need data. There's literally zero data on whether this mixed reality headset works in any possible way. It's taken us 6 months to even begin to work out the conditions for the objects to test and then the conditions for the people to be in when they're being tested. because it's a tricky technology to work with. So all of the qualitative analysis has been that people would rather have a 3D object in front of them and then walk around it rather than try to use the hand controls. Two reasons for that. One of them, actually moving, is very logical for us. The other is that the hand controls, the gesture control, is difficult because it's very twitchy. You control the mouse with where you look, and then you control clicking on and off with your hands. Now, you only have a couple of motions that you can do there. You can pretty much click and bloom and move. Okay, so the problem is that Hollywood's far in front of us. So everybody thinks it's like Minority Report or Marvel, and so they're moving their arms and they're waving at stuff, and the poor HoloLens has absolutely no idea. It's like yelling at your dog. It just, what the hell are you on about? I have no idea. It doesn't see any of those gestures, and it has to be very limited what you do. So you have to be really kind of gentle with it. We train people for a half an hour to an hour for them just to be able to use the thing without throwing everything off the screen and getting lost. So that's an issue. Comfort, we asked students, I'm trying to remember how many through the protocol, we asked them about comfort and using it so that we could test them. And most of them didn't find it that difficult to interact with. They found the moving around with it to be fine. They didn't have a big problem. They didn't like the clicking gesture. They had a hard time learning that. One of the issues, though, is virtually nobody said that they would wear one for more than an hour. And part of it is because in order to hold that computer in place, they clamp it on your head. And you can see there's going to be issues with head clamps. As a general rule, people don't like them. And so that's part of the learning. One of the other things that we initially did some tests and we thought, well, it'd be pretty easy. Turns out it's extraordinarily light sensitive. In order to be able to have Pepper's ghost in front of you, you need a lot of light coming up through your lens, coming back towards you, because it will be truly ghostly. I'm telling you, if we were doing ghost anatomy, it would have been awesome, because you could almost see through everything. And so they really like the light to be coming down from the top, not coming from behind. They like fairly low light conditions. We tried to simulate that in the room so you can have a look. If you try to look out the window, the bright window, you'll see that it fades out a little bit. The background, most people like a black chalkboard behind. That was a nice surface. White was low light white. Bright white with reflection, forget it. And also proximity was interesting. Most of the people like to have the proximity a meter and a half away. If you get too close, it begins to pixelate, and you actually enter into the object, which is freakish. And you get too far away, then the resolution is really working against you there. And so our protocol now is, it's taken us about 6 to 7 months. We finally have the circumstances where we can test this against other learning objects that we've been testing for perhaps the last 12 or so years. And as much as I would love to say, and I'm just going to tell you thank you for that, because we just finally worked out the conditions for testing, which I think are, you have to have another one, Richard, so we can actually tell you all about the results. But that is it. Thank you very much. Sure. Comments even, yes.
May I have a question? Okay. May I have a question for Professor Wainman? First, thank you very much for your interesting presentation. My question would be, how long would that take to produce the image you show?
Okay, so the image that we're showing in the HoloLens room, which is this model, scanned. So initially, we scanned it with our scanner as high a resolution as we can. It took us a very long time to figure out that it had to be smaller. And so, Michael, did it take us about 3 months? And that was mostly fiddling. I think we could go start to finish now, produce a really nice scanned object in a day. I don't think that would be too difficult. It depends on the texture and things like that.
Also, I guess you must have a very, very strong team to work together under your direction.
Yes. You notice I showed none of them. It's important. It's important when you give a talk to just pretend that you are outstanding, like, the great Caesar that I am. No. I have a lot of people. Most of the work you see is, in fact, done by undergraduate students. I've been fantastically lucky to have that, and medical illustrators that I have working in the anatomy department. So it would be a cast of about 24 people to do that sort of testing. So. Yes? It's so nice when people put their hand up, because students don't anymore. Do you notice that? They just start right in.
Thank you for the great talk.
Yes.
And I have a question about several med schools have closed their anatomy labs and they are using these virtual things.
Right.
And students, when they come to another university and they practice in the lab, they said that they are missing a very important part.
Yeah. So I have unique insight into that, strangely enough. So in the United States, we just, I work with the group from Case Western. They have a new medical school. And we put out a study every year asking medical schools what they're doing and how they're teaching and how many hours they're putting into anatomy and neuroanatomy and things. And all the schools that have gone to only plastic models and virtual reality and tables have all gone back to wet specimens, like cadaver specimens. There are, in fact, no schools in North America that do not use cadaveric anatomy, which surprised the hell out of me, because a few years ago, there was a lot of pressure from areas to say, yeah, do not, we're not going to use any more specimens and things like that. Failing their exams has a big effect on medical schools and things like that. And I often tell people, yeah, it'd be great. Like anytime you come and you've got a mannequin that's been in a really bad accident, man, you could kill, because you would know all the anatomy. But you don't treat mannequins, you treat people, and they don't look like the textbook. They really don't. I mean, the textbooks are these huge, hypertrophic young males, almost always. They look, the big, muscular, fantastic looking. Unless the rugby team gets in a car accident, you aren't seeing a lot of those people. We treat the elderly and the weak, and that's what real anatomy looks like, whether you like it or not, right? That's the way it looks like. So the students, in fact, feel quite cheated when they don't have that experience, because there's a pedagogical part of learning anatomy, and of course, professionally, everyone would need to know it somehow. But there's another part, right? There's this learning of altruism from looking at the specimen. There's this idea that that all of a sudden that's kind of your first patient. That's a whole other talk about the meta-learning that goes on. And I was really talking about cognition here, not so much about philosophy. So that's a big issue. But that's a great question, yeah.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering about the 3D printing. I don't know if you print in 3D the objects.
Yeah, that's our latest, funnest thing. The reason I got into 3D printing was because we often get these fantastic pathologies that come through. And you don't often get, 3 people with a, unhealed fractured right femur, right? Oh, good, we'll just collect all of those. So we've taken to finding really good pathologies, and then we scan them. We can either use CT, you get DICOM, stack it all up, and then print it. So those are neat. But anyway, I got printing them and using some of them. So we're just starting to work with the University of Buffalo, who has a way better printer than us, and printing up some other specimens, which has been fantastic fun. Because one of the things I want to do, right, of course, is to make the HoloLens version, the printed version, the paper version, the 2D version, and then test them all off, not just on pelvis. I'm starting to feel like a one-trick pelvis pony. I feel like we could start looking at other types of anatomy. And the other thing is, here's something that will blow your mind. What's the right size of a learning object? Nobody knows. Like if I'm trying to teach you the axis or the atlas, these vertebrae, what's the right size? Well, you would think the actual size, except a lot of the stuff is so small that you can't really see it. And one of the things we have is, a long time ago, someone just modeled a great big vertebra, great big lumbar vertebrae. We use that sucker all the time. The students love it. They're putting their hands through the hole. Hey, look, I'm the dorsal root ganglia. They get all excited. And so really, what's the right size for some of these things? Because you'd say the right size is the size you want. Okay, here's the problem. How am I going to teach the malleus, incies, and stapes of the ear? I mean, you could fit them all on my thumbnail. So actually, we don't know. Is it 5 times bigger than normal? Maybe it has everything to do with its normal size, and then, you know, up to a certain size, but we actually don't know. And now with 3D printing, we can do anything we want, right? It doesn't matter. You could do anything you want. You'd have to tell people, yes, this didn't come from an elephant, but in fact, it's a good question. Yep.
I'm just wondering, why do you think the handling is making an impact? And it's kind of getting me a little bit worried about using VR to teach surgery.
Oh, yeah. So, look, we weren't teaching surgery. Surgery is a fundamentally haptic kind of undertaking. And so, yeah, I don't think it would work great. I was just looking at, remember, big limitations to what I did. You're very kind to say, to doubt your whole life based on my study. To be honest, all I was teaching was nominative anatomy. Do you know the name of this structure? Apparently, handling it doesn't help you that much just to learn its name. That's not that bad, really. I don't have to handle a tree to know that that's a branch. You know, I mean, you can work these things. It makes some sense. But yeah, I would never suggest that it's going to, yeah, haptics is totally important. We teach it. And so my other hat, besides the pelvis, is running a surgical skills lab. And so we spend an awful lot of time with trying to just get what's the proper texture of when you're cutting through blank, what's the proper texture, what's the feedback that you need to have to do that. And we waste a lot of time, in fact, not really waste, but we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to make that experience as realistic as possible so that, you know, the person who replaces your knee, that's not the first time he's actually worked on human tissue, right? So yeah, we spend a lot of time reading about that. But haptics, I think, is important. It's just not for this. Sure, that's great. Any more questions?
Well, what's the real one? This one, not three. I have two, but I'll start with one.
Okay, okay.
So I guess my first question, perhaps my only, so the groups that you had, you taught with the plastic bottle, the VR,
Yeah.
Did you have a group that learned the wet model?
No, so at some point you need to have the gold standard, and we felt that the gold standard to test everybody on equally was to use the real anatomy. So the idea was that what helps you the most to learn real anatomy, yeah, and that was kind of presumed, that using exactly the same specimen with the same labels probably would have helped you a lot recalling the names of exactly the same specimen with the same labels. But that's why we did it. That's my statistician, blame him. But yeah, that's why. We assumed they would do as well as the plastic model. Is there another question? That was an easy one. He's glaring at you, so I don't know if that's good or not. Okay.
Okay. So I also wondered then if you looked at your participants' prior knowledge at all.
Yeah, so we took away everybody who had taken anatomy and physiology before. So we had a lot of first-year, second-year engineers, first-year health sciences students, that sort of thing. Yeah, so we didn't want them to be. And by the way, students, before they come to university, and many when they leave, don't know pelvic anatomy. So it was really good. It was like nobody knew the names of anything, which was kind of handy. Well, other than, you know, the external structures, and then just slang. So, but the bones of the pelvis, they were pretty much lost on. So that was a really good learning object, as it turns out. We did pre-test, and we tested MRT. I only had a few minutes, so I just kind of gave you the quick tour. Yeah. Good. Thank you.